For this lesson, I would like to focus on how you want to structure and organize your message for your intercultural presentation. I usually start out by talking about the scientific art of giving any sort of speech because it lays the foundation that you will need for all the elements that will be involved in articulating your message. The scientific art of giving any sort of speech is to tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you just told them. You're probably sitting there thinking, what? That makes no sense. But honestly, because a speech or a presentation is done with an intentionality, it needs to have consistency. So I call the scientific art of giving a speech the 3 T's. So you tell the audience what you're going to tell them. That's essentially the introduction. Tell them, that's the body. Tell them what you just told them. That's the conclusion. Now, there are several different key pieces of elements in order to pull this off. It sounds simple, but there are many steps involved. And I'd like to take the next several minutes to walk you through those steps. And I'm actually going to start with this middle piece first, because this is what we call the meat and potatoes of the speech. This is where you feed us the information about your experience. This is where you will spend the bulk of your time discussing your intercultural experience. Let's get started with the body. You will be placing your speech in topic order. So last lesson we talked about general and specific purposes. The general purpose is to inform. The specific purpose, that is the behavioral objective that you want your audience to have after hearing your speech. So if you look, this particular topic is about the Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans. My specific purpose is to inform my audience about 3 aspects of the Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans. My central idea, this is also known as the thesis. Remember, thesis and central idea are the same. So in the speech world, we call it a central idea. In the English world, in written communication, we call it a thesis. So when I use thesis or central idea, I'm doing so interchangeably. That means that they mean the same thing, so which is the overall main idea of your entire presentation or speech in one statement. My central idea here is Mardi Gras is a celebration in New Orleans. Following that, my previous statement, the Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans is renowned for its parades, costumes, and food. Now, that previous statement consists of 3 things: parades, costume, and food. These are what we call topics or topic order to the main topic, which is the Mardi Gras celebration in New Orleans. So the body of my speech should consist of 3 main points. Main point being number 1 being the parade, point number 2 the costumes, point number 3 the food. So if you look at my main points here for topic order, my topic sentence for my first main point is that the parades are lavish events that take place over the course of several weeks. My second main point will be the costumes include disguises, medallions, and the official Mardi Gras colors of purple, green, and gold. Lastly, the food, which is point number 3, features Cajun and Creole dishes common to southern Louisiana. Now what you see here in terms of the body, which is our focus at the moment, is that each of my main points has what's called a topic sentence to give an overview of what each main point is going to be. I will give multiple forms of support under each of those main points to help my audience visualize the main point itself. We call the supporting material, we have different types of supporting material. We have definitions, examples, statistics, analogies and comparisons, contrasts, anecdotes, quotations, and testimony. When I'm starting with my main point, the parades, I want to use at least 2 forms of supporting material for that first main point. And I want to use multiple forms of support. So maybe I use an example and maybe I use a comparison and contrast. That will help the audience to have a well-rounded understanding of what main point number 1 is about. Main point number 2 is about the costumes, including disguises, medallions, and the official Mardi Gras colors. So I'm going to want to use a variety of support again, depending upon what my goal is for that main point to help my audience visualize. I might use examples again and anecdotes, or maybe comparison and contrast with a definition. It's completely up to you and what you think will make the most sense for the audience to hear to help them visualize this point. You'll do the same for the last main point as well. You're focusing on Creole and Cajun dishes that are common to southern Louisiana. So you again might use a definition of what a Cajun or Creole dish is, along with an example or a quote or testimony from people who have maybe tried them. So whatever you decide to use for support for your main points, you need to make sure that you use a variety and that you have at minimum 2 forms of support for each main point. Supporting material can help explain and in a simple way a point that you're making for your audience to understand. It'll also make your presentation interesting. The audience might not walk away knowing everything about your speech, but based upon the support that you used, they will be able to draw back to that experience, to that one point as it related to your topic. So it'll make it interesting for them. It'll help them understand facts, and when we can understand the facts, it'll help us to understand the point you're trying to make. It also will show proof in the experience that you had, so it helps to visualize that proof as well. And it helps to build credibility with your audience. These are really important key factors when using support, and you have to be extremely intentional with the support you choose to use, because your audience needs to be able to understand the point it is that you're making. This just reiterates what we just talked about. Couple of things you want to be mindful of. This speech should be 5 to 7 minutes in length, so you want to make sure that you provide enough information for us to fully understand the experience that you had, but limit that to a certain point so that way we don't have what we call information overload. So you want to balance your information to make sure you have a well-rounded approach to each point that you're making to help us have a well-rounded view of the point it is that you're making. If we look at the guidelines for the intercultural presentation, the main points are put together for you already. The main points are your description, analysis, reflection, and comparison. So you will have 4 main points with at least 2 forms of support underneath each of the main points to help us to visualize the experience that you had. Something you must remember is that if we go up to each of these points, I give you information that I expect to hear throughout the point you're making. So for the description, you should describe in detail the event itself, what happened, and what your role was in the proceedings. This role in the proceedings simply means, were you an observer or were you a participant? Next is the analysis. This is where you're going to incorporate what you've been learning in class as it relates to intercultural communication, as well as doing a little bit of outside research. Your analysis should describe how culture and gender differences were displayed while communicating in the culture or co-culture you were observing or participating in. You should describe how the differences affected your interaction while you observed and or participated in the event, that should say. Next, what did you do to attempt to fit in during the observation or participation? And then describe the cultural values and norms you witnessed throughout the interaction. This is where you're going back to the information in the chapter that talked about individualism, collectivism, high-powered and low-powered distance, uncertainty avoidance, talk versus silence, competitive versus cooperative. So you're going to want to go back to chapter 3 and go back to the lesson in E360. Can't remember what lesson that was. Let me just go back here. That was lesson 7. So you'll go back to lesson 7 and just reaffirm some of the concepts that we have been talking about. Read the chapter, review the chapter in that section that talks about cultural characteristics. You can also use your textbook for the analysis portion of your presentation as a source, because remember, you're going to need at least 3 separate, reputable, documented, and retrievable resources. So your textbook can be one of them. And then lastly, discuss how this interaction increased your communication competence. That's all of point number 2. That's a big one. Next, your reflection. I ask that you discuss honestly your emotional and intellectual reactions to the event. Be open-minded, but don't sugarcoat. If something made you uncomfortable, there's nothing wrong with that. You should tell us. However, be prepared to identify why it made you uncomfortable, especially in the comparison section that's to follow, which is the last main point. You're going to compare the culture you observed and answer this question. What does this observation reveal about your own culture? And I talk about how we take for granted in our own culture how we do things until we interact with somebody that does them a little bit differently. And I use the example of peeling a banana. You might never have known that there were multiple ways to peel a banana until you met somebody with no hands who peels them with their feet, right? So that's an example. So again, for the body of your presentation, you need to have your main points, and your main point should consist of all right, so again, your main point should consist of the description of the event, the analysis, the reflection, and comparison. Those are the main points in the body of your presentation. And for complete detail for those guidelines, see number 2, page 3 on the assignment located right here. These are the elements that consist of the body of your speech. When you think about the guidelines, and when you think about oral citations, so the oral citations that you're going to need, if we look at the guidelines on page 5 of the document, under credibility in the content section, it says you must give oral source citations during the speech for at least 3 sources. You should give source information, credibility of the authors, and date of publication. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, what does all that mean? I want to take the next couple of minutes and talk about oral citations and then give you some examples. So you should orally cite sources that you are directly quoting from or paraphrasing information from. So your textbook is going to be one citation I should hear in your speech, and then wherever you decide to get additional information as it relates to aspects of your body of your presentation, you can get them from the internet or from books, magazines, or newspaper articles. But whenever you are taking information that is not common knowledge and that is not your own, you should use an oral citation, whether it be a direct quote or paraphrasing information. This will help you to avoid what is called oral plagiarism. Oral plagiarism simply means you're taking information that's not yours and attempting to pass it off as if it is, without any sort of credit to the people that gave you the information. When you are orally citing, you should have the title of the source. So if we look here in this example here, we've got Rolling Stones magazine here, or Budget Travel magazine. That's the title of the magazine. You should have the author. If there is no author, there should be a sponsoring organization. So for example, if you're taking something off of Mayo Clinic website, your source is the Mayo Clinic website if there are no authors. If there are authors, you'll state those, and you'll state the sponsoring organization if there is one. You will also need the date of publication in your oral citation. And lastly, you will also need, going back here, the title of the article. So if I'm just going to read this example here. If I'm taking an article from the Rolling Stones magazine, the article title I need to include in my oral citation would be 8 Dead at the Mall, a tale of an everyday massacre. So that would be the title of the article, title of where I got the article from. I would need the author. If there is no author, I'd need the sponsoring organization. And then I also need the date of publication. So let's see how that works together. If I'm using a personal interview and I'm paraphrasing the information, my oral citation might sound like this. In a 2014 interview with Dr. Jennifer Wang, head of the pediatrics unit at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, she emphasized that all children should be vaccinated for measles, mumps, and rubella. Right there, I have in my oral citation the date of publication, the person I interviewed, their credentials, where I interviewed them at, and the date of publication. I'm sorry, I already said that. That's an example of a personal interview paraphrase. If I'm taking something from a website that doesn't necessarily have an author, but it has a sponsoring organization, I might say something along the lines of, according to the honeymoon section on the website TripAdvisor, last updated 2013, the most popular honeymoon travel destination is Hawaii. Here I have the section, I have the website, and I have when it was last updated. If I'm directly quoting from, say, a book, again, I'd want the title of the book, the author, the date of publication. You can put the oral citation, those pieces of information, in any order that makes the most sense for you to articulate, but you must make sure that you use them at the time you are directly quoting information that isn't yours or paraphrasing information that isn't yours. Again, just to reiterate everything for oral citations, identify the book, magazine, newspaper, or web document you're citing. Identify the author or the sponsoring organization. Identify the date on which the document was either published, posted, or updated, depending upon where you're getting your source information from. That concludes our discussion on the body of the presentation. Now we're going to look at elements that are needed in the introduction and elements that are needed in the conclusion. Starting with the introduction, if I'm using my food analogy, the we said that the body is the meat and potatoes. The introduction is essentially where you create that information hunger. We start to salivate our palate for knowledge. So again, going back to my 3 T's, this is the section that tells the audience what you're going to tell them. You're previewing what the information it is that you'll be sharing in the body. So you need to grab our attention. I state your central purpose or your thesis of the presentation and provide a preview statement. You also need to arouse the audience's interest. This is what we call the dimension of credibility, where, and maybe if I put that in there, that'll make a little bit more sense. We call that the credibility statement. And the credibility statement, there are 2 dimensions of credibility. Research that you've done and personal experience that you've had. And you are going to have both of those dimensions of credibility to be able to include in your introduction. So we're going to go through these elements and piece by piece, starting with the attention. You can, when you're grabbing the audience's attention, you want to draw us in to the information that you're sharing. It could be by using a startling statement or fact, asking a rhetorical question, something we answer in our heads, telling an interesting or funny story, using a quote, using suspense, or your personal experience. However you choose to grab our attention, you need to make sure that it's relating to the topic that you're going to be talking to us about. So once you've grabbed our attention by using one of these devices as it relates to the content of your message, you'll state your credibility. And again, there are 2 dimensions of credibility: personal experience and research that you've done. And you'll have both of those elements because you're going to observe and or participate, and then you're also going to couple that with a little bit of research. Next, you'll state your overall main idea, which is that central idea, also known as the thesis, and then you're going to preview your main points. Remember, whatever order you choose to preview in, we've got the description, analysis, reflection, and comparison. Be sure that you list that in your preview statement. Next, I'll be discussing the description, analysis, reflection, and comparison of my insert intercultural event. Lastly is the conclusion. The conclusion, this is where you tell the audience what you just told them. You are getting ready to finish your presentation, and in order to do that, the conclusion needs to have 3 fulfilling functions. You need to forewarn your audience you're about to finish, and that's simply by using the statement "in conclusion" or "to conclude." You'll restate that central idea or the thesis, and you want to make sure that you restate it in the exact same order that you articulated it in the introduction. Everything we do is with intention with public speaking because you only have one opportunity to get your message across. Lastly, you'll review your main points, and whatever order you previewed them, whatever order, and it should have been the same order that you presented them in, you want to review them in that same order. Today I discussed my description, analysis, reflection, and comparison of my insert intercultural event. Then you'll lead the audience into some sort of vivid close. A way to lead the audience into a vivid close might be to balance out how you grab their attention in the first place. If you started with a startling statement or a fact, give us peace at the end based upon the information that you've provided for us. If you started with a rhetorical question, restate it for your vivid close, but then tell us the answer that we all should arrive to based upon the information that you shared. If you started with an interesting or funny story, it might be beneficial to end with that same story that was interesting or funny. If you started with a quote, maybe end with a quote that sums everything up that you just talked about in a nice, neat little way to lead the audience into a vivid close. Some things to consider. Don't just end abruptly. You need to signal, restate, review, lead to vivid close. Don't ramble at this part either. Don't introduce any new points. If you forgot anything in the body, when you get to the conclusion, you just have to let it go. Don't try to fill it in at that point because it confuses the audience as to whether or not you're actually finishing your speech. And whatever you do, if you make a mistake, whether it be at the conclusion, in the body, or in the introduction, don't apologize. This is about the only time in my life I tell people not to apologize, because we won't know you've made a mistake unless you tell us. And when you apologize, that tells us that you've made some sort of mistake. So when we look at the introduction, body, and conclusion, the things that we just talked about, telling the audience what you're going to tell them what you just told them, let's look at that as it relates to the guidelines of the assignment. In the introduction, I request that you have your attention getter, your thesis or central idea, your preview of main points, that your body has the description, analysis, reflection, and comparison. Those are your main points. Each main point should be clear and obviously distinct from one another. You need to have clear transitions, those linking statements. And then your conclusion. You need to restate your thesis or your central idea, review the main points that you just discussed, and lead us into some sort of vivid close. We talked about personal statements of credibility. We also talked about delivery last week. So if we look at the rating scale, it's a simple developing, mastering, emerging, developing, and mastering. So if nothing was there, it's a 0. It wasn't present. For sections that are worth 3 points, it's mastering and developing right here. For points that are worth 10, it's mastering, developing, and emerging, or was not present. So let's look at how that breaks down with the scoring guide. You'll see that in the introduction, you have 3 points possible. The body, I should say, 3 points possible. Transitions are worth 2. Your conclusion, 3 points possible. And then the content, this is where you feed us that knowledge in the body. This is worth the most out of all the elements in your presentation. So if you have everything present in the description, you'll get a 10. Again, looking at the mastering, developing, and emerging, that's what that means for this section here. Analysis is worth 10. Oral citations are worth 3. Reflection and comparison are worth 10. And then your delivery, broken up into vocal aspects of delivery and nonverbal aspects of delivery, those are worth 3. And then your presentation should be 5 to 7 minutes in length, and that's on a 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0 scale. So that breaks up how you want to structure and organize your presentation. I feel like I've given you a lot of information, and what I'm asking you to do is just to take a couple of minutes and really look at these guidelines and start to plan it out according to the elements that are necessary, starting with the body, the description, the analysis, the reflection, and the comparison, and then moving to the introduction and the conclusion. If you have any questions, feel free to email, call, or stop by. My next video is going to be talking about how to structure and organize the outline.